Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today at this education panel. Today, we're going to be talking about Jean-Paul Riopelle, his global and contemporary legacy. And my name is Sara Angel. I'm from the Art Canada Institute, where I'm the executive director. And I'm honored today to be talking to Manon Gauthier, who is the executive director of the Riopelle Foundation. Welcome, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. I was really looking forward to it. I want to acknowledge also the presence of Iseult Riopelle, the artist's daughter, who's with me today. I'm very grateful to have her here. We've had long discussions, and I'm learning so much every day with Iseult, so I want to thank her for being here.
Welcome, Iseult, and thank you for being here. And so, Manon, there's some really exciting news that is happening around Jean-Paul Riopelle, and it is because next October, 2023, will be his centenary, the centenary of his birth. And can you tell us a little bit about why that is so important, and what you are preparing for it, and why the foundation was created?
The dream of Jean-Paul Riopelle to have a foundation dates back to the late 60s. There were several attempts over the years, but his primary idea emerged from his years at the MAG Foundation in Saint-Paul-de-Vence when he was working in studios and workshops. We can think of les ateliers d'artistes d'aujourd'hui. And his only wish at the time was really to bring together artists and artisans of various trades in what he thought was, trades and techniques that were agonizing. So for him, it was that very meeting between the artists and the artisans and the various techniques. So bringing people together, which is what we're doing today by creating this foundation.
That's fascinating. And why has it taken so long to be realized, the idea of the foundation?
Well, I can't speak for Riopelle, but there were several attempts over the years until, came along a great philanthropist and collector in British Columbia who worked along with Madame Riopelle to really make this dream a realization. The foundation did not see the light of day while the artist was alive for several reasons, various attempts, and the very world of philanthropy of an artist foundation, the very models, they differ around the world. Riopelle had studied many of them in Europe, but, in his many travels, so I have some ideas in France, other ideas that came also back to Quebec on the very site where you have the National Museum of Fine Arts in the 80s as well, the old prison that was there. So I think the experimentation, the exploration, we're here today, almost 20 years after his passing, and we are honoring this dream of bringing together artists, disciplines, philanthropists, collectors. But I think that for the Riopelle Foundation, it's very much also about honoring his memory, his artistic legacy. But there's a very strong component to the foundation that really seeks to transmit knowledge. So you either discover Riopelle, rediscover his art and his techniques. For a career that spanned over 60 years, over 7,000 artworks around the world. You have Riopelle artwork in over 60 public collections in the world, over 18 countries. So we have a very important story to tell.
Well, that's a perfect segue into learning more about his career. Here's a picture of a very young Riopelle who began creating art as a young boy. And here we're looking at a work by one of his teachers, somebody named Henri Bisson, and then a work that Riopelle did. Looks totally different from the way that we think about Riopelle today, the way that we understand him. Can you tell the audience a bit about his early days, about the start of his career?
Absolutely. His parents actually encouraged him to take drawing and sketching lessons. And here in his very hometown of Montreal at École Saint-Louis-Gonzague on the Plateau Mont-Royal, and that's where he took these lessons with Henri Bisson, which was very the fundamentals of art. At the time, obviously, the very realistic, so the copying, the portrayal of nature, of landscapes, of still life, so very all the basics. Another thing that was also important at that time is, in French you say faire l'école buissonnière, so here we could say école buissonnière because they also did a lot of field works. And I think that what you have also is experimentation. Saint-Fabien is a good example of that as well. So through that experimentation, I think that he was seeking also to find his own style, to find perhaps something more challenging and not so much emulating the still life or the pictorial aspect of it, but really depicting the world the very way he saw it. So his techniques evolved also over time. He attended l'École des Beaux-Arts, but there was a very rigid framework there. That's where he also encountered many of his friends from les automatistes. But that's also why Jean-Paul Riopelle went to Polytechnique. That's also why he went to l'École du Meuble, so that he could explore a diversity of disciplines and techniques, because his interests were very versatile as well.
So here is a painting from later on. He's gone to start studying, in fact, with Bordeaux and his style has transformed quite a bit from what we saw previously. And he also begins to be in conversation with les automatistes, who are so important in the story of both Canadian art history and international art history. Can you tell us a bit about the impact and the relationship between Riopelle and les automatistes?
Absolutely. His art often reminds me that it was not an extremely long period of his life and of his career, but it was one that was very significant, especially considering the times. You're looking at social conventions and the rigidity of the church, and the feeling also that some of the teachings were limiting the very expression of their creativity. So I think Les Automatistes was really a plea for freedom at the time, for total unconditional artistic freedom. So that's where he met Marcel Barbeau, that's where he met Madeleine Arbour, Pierre Gauvreau, Fernand Leduc. There were many women very important also in the automatiste movement. So I think if you look back at the time, the late 40s, I think that's also very significant that men and women came together for this important cry for unconditional artistic freedom. If you look at today, the themes that were relevant then are still very much relevant today when you think about artistic freedom. The Refus Global will also be 75 years in 2023 on the occasion of the birth of the centenary of Jean-Paul Riopelle. And many of the automatistes are still with us, fortunately. And I think it's a very good opportunity also to honor that very important time in Quebec society, in Quebec culture, Quebec politics, and religion as well.
And for those in the audience who don't know about the Refus Global and the importance of it, can you tell us in a phrase or two about its significance?
Well, the significance is tremendous. It's not a very long work to read. I think it's more actual than ever. So it is really that plea and that defiance of the conventions of the time, and that call for total and absolute freedom of expression artistically. But if you look at today, it is still the case when we're talking about cultural appropriation, when we're talking about censure, when we're talking about the very act of of creating should not be limited by convention. It should not be dictated also neither by politics or social conventions. So that's very much, and when you say it's global refusal, it was an act of rebellion, but it was also an act of, that created an intellectual legacy for the entire province. And, it's not unrelated or too different from the surrealist rupture inaugurale, inaugural rupture. So you see that in the world, the post-war world, that this call for expression, for autonomy and independence from artists was ever present. I would say there's some universality about it. The one thing that is that always I puzzle with still today is just the very name of automatiste. Just if we, without getting into the semantics too much, but something I'm struggling with is, an automatic movement seems repeated, seems not as indicative of the spontaneity of the impulses, the creative input that has no framework from the beginning and the end. So that's something I think that is still very relevant.
Very relevant. Then Riopelle leaves Montreal and he ends up going to Paris. And he's certainly renowned in the 20th century of the canon of 20th century Canadian art as the artist who has had the most global impact. And very much this begins with his work that he's doing in Paris. When he goes to Paris, can you tell us a bit about this famous work that he creates, and a bit about what happened, what takes him there, and then how the story unfolds?
Absolutely. I think in the late 40s, he gets to France, and that's where his network really takes off. That's where I think his association with the surrealist movement had as much to do, if not more, with the company he kept there and those that he met at the time as well. That really, I think, helped shape his views on art. I think it was more about inspiration. Also, Riopelle always said it was not so much about the influence. The only artist that he said had influence on him was Ozias Le Duc, an artist that he visited on occasions back in Quebec, and who's, he was fascinated with Le Duc's technique of, taking sometimes 4 years to create a painting, reapplying paint. I was discussing it with Iseult also over the seasons. If it was the fall, then he made the leaves fall. If it was winter, he made it snow. And, at the end, the three would be this gigantic masterpiece. But the thought process and the freedom and the evolution of the art, I think, had deep influence. But I think that the years in Paris were also probably echoed by the vibrancy of Parisian life, by the work where Riopelle got his first studio on Rue du Rantin, what you see on the screen in 52. And he had a tremendous production of works in those decades as well, and experimented with techniques, experimented with matter also. When you look at those artworks, you see that huge concentration of color, fragments of landscapes, and talking about techniques, there's much that is said about Riopelle painting directly from the paint.
Tell us about that, Manon. I think in many ways, the innovation, the technique that Riopelle is most renowned for, using a palette knife, that is something that begins while he is working in Paris. And for those who aren't art historians in the audience, how does this innovation, how does this technique come to pass?
I think Iseult says that Riopelle is an alchemist of matter. I think that matter was extremely important for Riopelle, as was experimentation. And it's not so much that he painted directly from the tube. He experimented with paintbrushes and various other techniques, but the fragment, the filament of colors in there, and the application, the experimentation with impasto, where you have really thick layers of of paint, and that's very typical, almost sculptural in Riopelle's work. And I think that he found there the very way that, you know, the 50s brought to life that movement. When you look at the 50s, when you look at Riopelle's artwork throughout his career, you see a lot of movement. And it's not foreign to his very own travels to France, his very own travels around the continent, also with the family. You know, Riopelle was joking about, you know, traveling is sometimes just to, you know, go and find titles for the paintings that were already done. I know that Iseut and Sylvie were often called to sit in the room and determine titles for the painting.
Fascinating.
It is. So there's something, you know, sometimes we think a lot and we overthink the very significance of a painting. You know, with Riopelle, you have many untitled. For that reason, it leaves room to the entire imagination. And sometimes the titles are completely unrelated because they're the result of either a travel or a game. But those years, I think, are what propelled his career. But there's so much more when you look when you look back at before those years, and then when you look after, and I know we'll get to the 60s and 70s also, but I think the Mosaic period, Maine, is international fame and renown, and I think that it was really motivated also at the time by those exchanges with the surrealists and with artists like Zoe Wookie, Vieira, and his years with the Pierre Loeb group of artists.
And Manon, you had talked about how in the 1950s a lot was going on in the world, a lot with movement, a lot with techniques, etc. I wanted to show these two images side by side, not because the painting technique is the same, but because there were two artists who were working in the same way at the same time, Jean-Paul Riopelle, Jackson Pollock. On the surface, there appears to be a similarity, but can you tell us about perhaps how inaccurately they are sometimes compared?
Yeah, it's a long myth also, and there were many debates and many studies on saying, you know, who was copying who. That's not what it's about. And as you can see also on those pictures, the very technique is completely different. You know, dripping, it is the very act of dripping. The technique that Riopelle was using his paintbrush, and it's more maybe the precursor of spraying. It's
interesting.
You know, and I know we'll talk about that a little later, but, you know, when you think that, you know, with time, Riopelle started experimenting also with various techniques, just look back at these. And that's why movement is also important, and understanding the history around Jean-Paul Riopelle's artwork and looking at those images, you could see also that there were two completely different ways of looking at art and of working the art. So thank you for putting that picture on, actually.
No, it's fascinating, and what's also fascinating is that when Riopelle is living in Europe, he's living there with Joan Mitchell, who we see in this image, and Life magazine ends up doing a story on Jean-Paul Riopelle, and saying that he is the heir to Claude Monet. And the comparison of this work, of this Monet painting, the Jean-Paul Riopelle painting, it's fascinating that one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is Monet's work looks abstracted, but it's not. He's looking at his garden. And was Riopelle's work abstracted? And can you tell us a bit about the influence of Claude Monet on his career?
Yes, I wouldn't say influence, I would say inspiration, certainly. I think that it's important to look back and honor the artists that came before. In the case of Jean-Paul Riopelle, it's also true today, because when you look at, for example, what Marc Séguin is doing, and also the heir of Jean-Paul Riopelle artistically, there's continuity in the world of art when you look at artists. And, you know, I'm always puzzling with the fact that we are comparing. Here, it's not about the comparison, it's about the continuity. And it's about finding that source of inspiration and the fascination that Jean-Paul Riopelle did have. And when you look at these paintings, you will see that perhaps there's no way that we could get into Riopelle's mind. I want to be clear about that. I know sometimes people say, you know, what was he thinking? It's impossible otherwise, you know, I wouldn't have figured it out, but, you know, Isolde could speak at length about that. But you see fragments of colors, so perhaps you say, you know, the inspiration about landscape. You see the elements that you will find in Riopelle's art, fragments of landscape, of color, experimentation. Riopelle said he never painted anything abstract his entire career. He said that's just the very way he viewed the world. You can look at Pavane, you could look at Indian Summer, you could look at several works by Jean-Paul Riopelle where you could look back and think, well, was this also greatly inspired by Monet?
And I think part of the inspiration with Monet is that he was living in very close proximity to where Monet had lived.
L'esprit des lieux,
yes,
effectively.
yes.
So being so immersed, and when Riopelle lived in Véteuil with John Mitchell, and that was also an extremely important period where he was deeply immersed in the community. You know, going to the cafe, being friends with the locals, exchanging, living. So you do find that vibrancy in his art, and I think that honoring also, you know, the shared passion for these two artists for that region is also very important.
I put this image on the screen because, again, it is an image that is not an abstracted image.
Yeah.
And then I have these images because it leads into a question that I wanted to ask you about an exhibition that was on here in Montreal at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts and now is at the Audain Museum in Whistler. And it tells another component of Riopelle's career, which is that Riopelle came back from France to Canada, and in Canada, there was a tremendous amount of inspiration both from Indigenous cultures as well as from the North. And can you tell us a bit about the exhibition that is now taking place and the genesis of it?
Well, that's an idea that goes back to the early 2000s that Isolde created. It took some time, you know, to process and to get museums really to address the reality also of the Great North and Indigenous culture. And something that's very interesting about Riopelle's connection with the First Nations, you know, there was an interest very early on. It's very much related also to his love of nature, his love of fauna, flora. But the real interest in Riopelle is mostly inspired by his readings, by the exhibitions, by this very own anthropological view of First Nations. And when you look at the recent exhibition that is now indeed at the Audain Art Museum in Whistler, we'll travel to Fredericton, we'll travel to Calgary as well, leading to the centenary year. What's interesting is Riopelle did not journey in the Great North too long. He went a few times in the 70s, continued to study and be fascinated by the landscapes, you know, the iceberg series in the 70s and late 70s, the string games also, that very notion of game also deeply inspired him. I think the connection is a dialogue and a way to not interpret, not copy. It is a very way of sharing the culture.
Can you tell us about the dialogue on screen right now about these two works?
Yes, absolutely. You see, for Riopelle, the string games were very important, and you see it in certain artworks. Sometimes it's evoked in a title and it has nothing to do with string games, but sometimes it's about the titles of the artwork. I think the fascination with that is really portrayed in the 70s. When you look at this exhibition that went to the Museum of Fine Arts, you find that almost playful interpretation And the string games for the First Nations were also a very means of communications. I don't know if you recall when we were young and playing with those. And it is really that vehicle for culture, whether you see it in sculpture, whether you see it in paintings, that's something that remained ever present also throughout his years in the 70s and even later.
Fantastic. And I want to look at this work that was a work that is a phenomenal work that is in Quebec City, an epic work. And this is a work that Riopelle, again, one of the things that marks his career and so makes him such an interesting artist is that his technique changes often. And so this here we're looking at a view of the work from a distance. And then I also wanted to put in a slide that showed details of the work and to also show these two figures, Rosa Bonheur and Rosa Luxemburg. Can you tell us about this work, both about the technique as well as what does this mean? The work was called the Hommage à Rosa Luxemburg.
Hommage à Rosa Luxemburg was also an incredible symbol, a code, and we'll go through some of the elements, but it was really his ultimate, his living testament to Joan Mitchell. So when he learned of her passing, he got this creative impulse and went and worked on these three panels. Really, it's a code. We have not fully interpreted yet. I think there's matter there for decades to be able to decrypt and to look at the technique and to look at the various symbols. But it also encompasses everything that Riopelle has worked throughout his career. You think that it's a new technique, but when you're talking about spray paint, because that's when also he used spray cans, among other, and everyday objects, you see life, you see death, you see nostalgia, you see nature, you see hope, you see regret, and the technique in itself evolved. Remember when we were looking at those two pictures before with Pollock and with Riopelle, what Riopelle was doing was not dripping. It was a form of, the precursor of spraying. He was spray painting, but with a different tool. So you always look back at the various periods of his life. So Rosa Luxemburg is really the ultimate testament to his love for Joan Mitchell. It's also his last official artwork. It is the one that tells the story of an entire career. It's the one that we not so soon will be finished interpreting.
No, and not anytime soon. And that brings to the final slide where we began. And what I wanted to ask you as a last question is about Riopelle's legacy today. And where do you see his legacy most profoundly?
I think what matters most to all of us at the Riopelle Foundation, whether Michael O'Dane or co-founder with Iseut Riopelle, with our founding members, we have Dr. John Porter, also a well-renowned art historian. We have collectors, philanthropists who are all gathered for one purpose, is yes, to honor his memory. I think that there's much of the foundation's purpose. And it's true for other artists as well. It is to celebrate the past, but not just to celebrate the past. It's really to see how can we honor his memory by making it relevant again today. How can we honor his memory by transmitting the wealth of artworks, of knowledge, and the messages, and the very passion that Jean-Paul Riopelle had for nature. It's if you took a look at one element that moved him throughout his life and career was nature. But our foundation was created not only to perpetuate his work, not only to commemorate his life, but to bring together the cultural world, visual arts first and foremost, of course, but just as diverse diversified were Riopelle's interests in theater, in architecture, and the various trades, artisans, so are we. So we are working with museums, we are working with theater, we are working even with circus. Jean-Paul Riopelle was a great fan of circus art also, even back in the 50s. Literature as well. So bringing together, which is the reason he wanted a foundation, artists and arts in various disciplines to create that contemporary dialogue about the very theme that were dear to him: nature, environment, migrations, the small things of everyday life. When you looked at Rosa Luxembourg before, you see that Riopelle was extremely avant-garde in his way of recycling, reusing, experimenting, taking risks. One of the reasons that he didn't continue for a while with sculpture, which he took on again later in the 60s, was that at the time he didn't even have money to experiment with matter and to bring his ideas to where he wanted it, and he continued to experiment. So that brings me to one of our incredibly important mission, is in creating this foundation, in creating a large program for the centenary celebration. We also want to bring together today's artists and tomorrow's artists around the knowledge, around this career, but also to encourage them to push their own limits. When you create a foundation like this, you also have a responsibility to transmit the knowledge, to foster the next generation of experts, of artists, of audiences as well. So our mission is really centered on making sure that once we have delivered a fantastic program in 2023, once most of the projects will tour, once this is all said and done, we need to create also an intellectual legacy. And that's what the foundation will aspire to. So we will be announcing within the next 2 weeks our program for the International Centenary of Jean-Paul Riopelle. And what we've discussed today will also really be reflected in the program that we will carry forward.
Thank you, Manon. It sounds like we're going to be hearing some very fascinating, very exciting news in the weeks ahead, and that in the years ahead, the next couple of years, seeing some very inspiring work take place in the name of Jean-Paul Riopelle. So thank you for speaking with us today. It's been an honor to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.